Good morning, everyone. Every time this year, the board begins to consider those issues related to the Capital Improvements Program, CIP. During today's meeting, the superintendent will present her recommended fiscal year 2025 capital budget and the FY25 through 2030 Capital Improvements Program. Subsequently, the board will hold a work session on November 10th, as well as hearings for the public to provide testimony on November 6th and 7th. The hearings will be held in person and will be open to the public. The board also will accept pre-recorded audio and video submissions for individuals who wish to remain virtual. Information about our meeting and hearing schedule, how to sign up online for the hearings, and how to submit testimony is available on our website. If alternatives are offered during the work sessions, the board will hold a hearing on November 13th. Again, the November 13th hearing will only be held if alternatives are offered to what we are hearing today on November 10th. So anyone interested in submitting testimony, signups are open to speak during the aforementioned hearings. The board will meet on November 16th to make its decisions on the CIP. In terms of today's meeting, the superintendent will present her CIP. If there are items the superintendent is recommending that board members wish to modify, it would be helpful for affected communities to know about a potential modification prior to the public hearings. Therefore, I am encouraging that we identify any modifications now at today's work session. Before I turn the meeting over to Dr. McKnight, who is joining us virtually, I will just remind board members that this is just the superintendent's presentation of the CIP. Although clarifying questions are in order, we will have an opportunity to explore the CIP in more depth and ask detailed questions during the next work session. We have board members joining us here in person and board members joining us virtually. So if I could just get board members to introduce themselves so folks know who's here and who's virtually, that would be helpful. Mr. Saeed.
Hello, everyone. Sami Saeed. Very excited to hear about the CIP today.
I love your enthusiasm. Good morning, Rebecca Smandrowski, District 2.
Good morning, buenos dias, Grace Rivera-Oven, District 1.
Good morning, everyone. Julie Yang, District 3.
Ms. Wolf?
Good morning, everyone. Brenda Wolf, District 5.
Ms. Harris?
Good morning, everyone. Nice to see you all.
Okay, and with that, I turn it to Dr. McKnight. So good to see you virtually, Dr. McKnight, and welcome back. We are so happy to see that you are doing much better.
Thank you, President Silvestri, and good morning. I have to say it is very, very good to see you all as well virtually. I just want to take a moment to just say thank you to the Board of Education, to any of our families that are watching, our students, the staff. It is good to be back virtually. The outpouring of love through messages in so many different ways over the past few weeks just reminds me of how wonderful it is to be a part of a community that is filled with love and support in so many different ways. And so I'm grateful to be here and just thankful to be able to return. And I am much appreciative to the staff who've been able to continue to support the board's needs and the community's needs and the students' needs as I have been out for the last couple of weeks taking care of my health. So I was looking forward to the meeting today. I say I couldn't come back at a better time than to really get into the nuts and bolts of talking about the CIP. And so today, as Ms. Silvestri just said, we're going to share a presentation, and basically it's going to cover the recommended fiscal year 2025 capital budget and the 2025 to 2030 capital improvements program. And so every year we know that October is our time to dig into this area of work, and that's what we're looking forward to doing today. Just to give a few points before we get deeper into the presentation, our FY 2025 is the first year of the biannual CIP review process. So this is in alignment with the Montgomery County Charter that all CIP projects are considered in odd number fiscal years. So just to remind us of that. So therefore, the CIP is going to receive a full review by the county executive and the county council during the coming months. And I think that's very important as we go through this presentation, because there will be a lot of interactions and work with the county executive and the county council as we work through this. So the Board of Education's requested FY24 capital budget and the amendment of the 23 through 28 CIP actually totaled $1.936 billion, which was an increase of $166.7 million more than what was previously approved in our last CIP. And so the process is that the County Council adopted the FY23 to 28 amended CIP for MCPS, totaling $1.906 billion for a 6-year period. Now, this decrease actually could have been greater, but we are grateful that the County Council adopted the increase on the recordation tax rates, which did provide additional funding for MCPS. So we shared this with County Council, and we continue to show how those types of changes have been able to help us significantly in so many different areas. And then just to give a little background for us to think about as we go into the CIP, I want to talk a little bit about enrollment, because I think the enrollment piece continues to have to come forward in the forefront of the planning for the CIP, especially as we think about where enrollment has been in MCPS and what is projected to come, because we have to consistently plan for where we are right now, but the students that we expect to come over time in MCPS. So of course, during the past 10 years, our enrollment has grown more than 1,200 students. We did have a setback during COVID-19 in which our enrollment did decline, but we did have a rebound of enrollment last year. If you remember, last year was our first full year out of COVID-19. And so that's when we saw the most significant stability in our enrollment since the pandemic. And for this school year, of course, we just sent over our official account to MSDE, as we always do every year on September 30th. And our enrollment this year on September 30th was 160,770 students, which was a 1-year increase of 216 students from our last year September 30th enrollment. Now, one other piece I always like to point out as we go into our CIP process is we are a very mobile county. And so our students don't fit into this perfect space of coming in and enrolling in MCPS by September 30th. September 30th date is the day that we give the official enrollment for funding to the state. But as we know, our enrollment every year continues to move and change as the school year goes along. So that's something else that we just continue to watch. And when we think about our total school system enrollment, that is projected to increase to approximately 167,000 students by our 2030 school year. So really thinking, 7 years from now, where we're going to be, we're thinking, and our projections show we should be planning for about a 7,000 increase number in students. Now, when you think about that over a 7 to 8 year period, there are a few things that we always have to keep in mind, and we've been looking at this for the past few years. This projection that I just shared does represent a slowdown in enrollment growth, particularly when we look at the continued decline we've seen in resident births here in Montgomery County, which has then created a slower enrollment in kindergarten. So that means we've then started to have smaller cohorts of students as they progress through the school system each year, when we see a decline of students in kindergarten, which has then contributed to a decline of births in Montgomery County. But I would say even with this projected slowdown in growth, the capital projects that are included in the recommended CIP are warranted, and they must remain on schedule, not only due to just things that we're talking about around enrollment, but based on many of the conversations that we've been having about facilities and the needs to make sure that our buildings are what they need to be and what they should be on schedule. So therefore, my recommended CIP totals $1.999 billion, which is an increase of $93.6 million more than what was previously approved in the CIP. And just to give you some specifics about what it includes maintaining the completion dates of all capital projects included in the adopted CIP, providing additional funds to address budget shortfalls to have projects remain on their approved schedules, funding for 3 new addition projects, funding for 5 new major capital projects, funding for new countywide initiatives, and then there's also funding to increase our countywide systemic projects. So our presentation today is really going to focus on the enrollment forecast, which I just talked about. We're going to provide an overview of my recommendation for the CIP, and then also review some non-capital recommendations. So we're going to have a number of meetings over the next few weeks to continue to drill down and have some public conversation so that our community members also fully understand exactly what this process is and all of the things that we're taking into consideration in the CIP. And I look forward to us continuing to work with our community members and our school staff and parents and students alike as we work through this process. So at this time, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Hull, our Chief Operating Officer, and our Associate Superintendent of Facilities Management, Seth Adams. And I believe I see Adrian at the table as well. It's a little hard to see from this angle. So Ms. Carvijas, we welcome you as well. And I'll turn it over to them to go through the specifics of the presentation. I look forward to our conversation. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you, Dr. McKnight, and welcome back. We are all very happy to see you again. I think you covered it all, so without further ado, I'll turn it over to Mr. Adams and the team.
Mr. Adams, if you could just, to get us started, could you explain what I mentioned in my opening remarks in terms of alternatives? I know that was a challenge for me to understand when I first joined the board in terms of the additional hearing and then alternatives that a board member might introduce today.
Sure. So thank you for that question. Alternatives typically apply to non-capital around boundary studies, different options, but there's also opportunities for board members to introduce different elements of the CIP for consideration. So what's before you today is the superintendent's recommendation, and then obviously translates into a board vote and ultimately a board request to the county executive and ultimately county council. So if there's any changes from the recommendation to your request, obviously then the community will have opportunities to weigh in on any of those types of changes. But the alternatives typically just apply to boundary studies.
Okay, that's what I thought. Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so we'll get started. If we could pull up the slides, we'll go to the next slide. Just dive right into the agenda. There's a lot of information here, so we're going to try to make it as exciting as possible. So everybody pays close attention. But the agenda will go through the student enrollment. Actually, Dr. McKnight went through quite a bit of this, so I'll just touch on this. Then we'll go into funding of the capital improvements program, which really gets into the dollars and cents, where the funding streams are coming from. Then we'll go through the superintendent's recommended budget as well as capital improvements program, which we'll talk about individual projects, and then we'll outline some of the specifics around the next work session. So if we go to the next slide. This is the timeline for our work. So obviously today is the first work session, but more importantly, the review and presentation of the superintendent's recommendation. We will have 2 public hearings on the 6th and 7th, another work session on the 10th. If needed, the 13th as a 3rd public hearing. Again, this is where if there's anything that's introduced at the work session that's different from what we've been discussing, the opportunity for the public to come out at that public hearing. And then finally on November 16th, the board action on ultimately your request of the CIP moving forward. Next slide. So again, we'll talk, this is just the overview of the enrollment information. Dr. McKnight did go through this, but as she mentioned, there was a steady increase over time as COVID hit. We did see a decrease. Last year we saw, a students starting to return, and this year it's leveling off. And we're going to go into detail around what that looks like and ultimately what that means in the future as well. But we have seen, as Dr. McKnight said, decreases in our kindergarten, obviously, as in that translates into our elementary school age. And that's a result, obviously, of reduced births over time. But we do have our demographer here, Robin O'Hara, that would be able to answer any questions just about what has happened and what we predict in the future around births, around enrollment moving forward. Next slide. As Dr. McKnight mentioned, the September 30th enrollment is 160,770. I just reiterate this September 30th is a state requirement. I think we all know, as you heard from Dr. McKnight, that enrollment, does move throughout the school year. We have students that come in, whether it be international enrollment within the country, students that leave. So I know we'll talk a little bit about just what that looks like and how the trends look from year to year on some of that movement. But this does represent an increase of 216, which is a little bit lower than what we were predicting. And obviously we'll walk through why we think that is the case, and then we'll also show regionally what some of the trends have been, and you'll see that what's happening here is very consistent across the region. Next slide, we'll go into the details. This is a slide that really shows the enrollment by grade level, and I honestly can't read that either. So.
Easier.
But you can see that how it's categorized is the official from the year before, preliminary 2023, 2024, the 1 year change from last year to this year, and then ultimately the growth decline from grade level to grade level. That means as students move as cohorts through the school district, what that looks like. But you can see where you get to the bottom line, the total for the 1 year increase is 216 to bring us to that 160,770 number. And again, a couple highlights you can see here, the one year changes in kindergarten, first grade. We did see those declines from 230 to 433, so you can see where some of the numbers are down in the early years of our K-12. Next slide. This is a slide, again, that just represents year to year what the births have looked like, and then ultimately how that translates to kindergarten enrollment. Our demographer and the team look at that as basically a capture rate, looking at how many children were born, and then obviously how that translates into the kindergarten enrollment. You can see from 2018 to this year, in 2023, there was 12,373 births that translated into 10,372 kindergarten enrollment. Obviously, that doesn't exactly translate to births to those exact same students, but that's a general way of how our demographer looks at enrollment trends over time. And you can see that's a capture rate of about 83.8%, which has been down since COVID. I think there's also an idea that may start to uptick over time as it gets back to those 2013, 2014 years. But you can see that came down to the under 80 during the COVID times, and it's just slightly rebound up into the low 80 percentile range. Next slide. And again, this is the enrollment over time. You can see we had that steady increase. And even if you go back before 2013, pretty much that same trajectory, slope of enrollment trend over time. We saw that dip, a slight return last year, and then obviously leveling off to that 167.70. Just another way to look at it. But still, this represents about 10,000 students over the course of 10 years, which is significant. That's not something, and as Dr. McKnight mentioned, there's capacity challenges that we still are working to manage as part of this overall CIP. So again, just to look at it from a historic trend perspective. Next slide. This is the projections out for the 6 years. As we've mentioned before, our capital improvements program does look at our 6-year projections. That's the sort of the basis of why recommendations are made around different projects. And as you can see, the number in the 2029, 2030 year is at that 167,543, and this is a projection. These are based on the trends that we've seen over time. These are based on geographic factors that are happening. You can see that between this year and next, we are predicting, an increase. But ultimately, as we look at this from a projection over 6 years, we are still seeing that trend of increase over time. And again, when we get into this year and the next year, I think there's other factors that are play. I mean, obviously, when you think about enrollment projections as a whole, there's development, which is new housing. There's turnover of housing, and when you see interest rates that are out there now, I mean, that's certainly impactful to what we're seeing. Development as well, but we are predicting that this will increase over time as we move forward. And why this is important, and again, I think I just want to stress, our capital improvements program, we start today with a recommendation for a new project. Theoretically, realistically, we would not open or have a project that's available to students until that 2028, 2029, 2030 timeframe. So it's really important to look at these enrollment projections and make sure we're as accurate as we can be. And we are accurate, so within 1% of projections over time, and that's been a long-standing trend that we've seen. So kudos to our demographer for being able to manage this somewhat unpredictable nature of enrollment. Next slide. This is just another way to look at it. The enrollment by, broken down between elementary, middle, and high. You can see that, the enrollment that really occurred over the early years, and that particularly that 2007 to 2013 range was at the elementary level, and that gradually went into the secondary schools. You can see the decline since COVID has been predominantly at the elementary level, and you saw that from the grade by grade when we looked at that graph. And then obviously predicting out that does seem to be more of a steady increase, a slower increase at the elementary, but still managing that growth at the secondary schools. Next slide. And again, we're going to get into demographics of our enrollment, and we've shown this slide over time, but you can see the trends since back to 2004 to where we are today. This is enrollment by race and ethnicity. You can see Hispanic is at the 56,724 enrollment number. White non-Hispanic is at, boy, I'm going to have to pull this on my computer here. I'm sorry. 38,449. You can see African American is at 34,716, Asian at 21,995, and then two or more races is at 8,435. And you can see there's some trends there where some of the demographic information shows increases, others are steady, slight increases, and then others are declining. But this is something that obviously we have seen over time and continues to trend in the same directions of what we've been showing over the past couple of years. Next slide. This is just a different way to see it, a color graph to show it from scale. And you can just see based on, where we are today, we are obviously seeing numbers that are pretty equivalent across the board. Obviously, Hispanic is slightly larger, but many of the other demographic numbers are very similar. And obviously, as we start to think about this trending out, we don't necessarily predict and do enrollment projections based on demographic, but you can see these trends are continuing to play out in the county. Next slide. So here is our annual change in total enrollment, and again, we like to show a lot of different graphs and how this looks, but you can see that big decline during COVID, the rebound last year, and then where we are with just the leveling out of this year. But what we do see, and going back to the other slide, is that we do predict that our change in enrollment will be consistently in that 1,500 to 2,000, 2,500 over time as we see things continue to develop and change within the county. Next slide. And this last slide we felt was important. This is a new slide for us, but just to show what's happening, regionally. We looked at this year's enrollment and sort of how it leveled off from last year, and there's lots of questions. Like, so why did that happen? So one of the things that the team looked at was just, geographically, were we an anomaly, or was this something that we saw, throughout the region? And the reality is, throughout the region, everyone saw a bit of a slowdown, a leveling off from last year to this year. And again, so when you start to think about, what are causing that, housing market, interest rates, other economic pressures certainly are obviously first and foremost to some of the ideas. Obviously, as this year continues, we'll dive in deeper and really start to poll and work with other agencies and jurisdictions to better understand this. But you can see this isn't just purely development. This isn't just purely turnover. There's probably lots of other factors that are contributing to this year's leveling off of enrollment. So with that, we'll go to the next slide and open it up for any discussion.
Okay, board members, please turn on your lights if you have any questions. And I just wanted to, let's see, I think I had a question about international student enrollment. That tends to be thousands of students every year. What has that looked like this summer or over the last year? Has that declined as well, or is that continues to be steady? That tends to be a high school every year, right, worth of kids. Where are we with that?
So great question. Last year, international enrollment between the beginning of summer to the end of October, we introduced 2,353 students into the district based on the International Enrollment Office. This year, we're actually trending to be higher than that number. So we've, between now and same time as last year, we have cleared enrollment for 2,131 students, and there's a total of 2,861 that are in total that are projected to come into the system. So we are actually seeing an increase from last year of international enrollment.
Okay, I think that's an important piece of information. While the enrollment is somewhat steady or flat, the international student, which affects our secondary schools typically more so than our elementary schools, and of course the services that are needed with that population. Mr. Hull?
Yeah, if I could just point out also that we know that those students historically, and no reason to think it will be different this year, come to us throughout the school year. And so we will continue to see those students enter the school system throughout the rest of the school year.
Yeah, and I would just encourage us to make that part of the presentation every year. I mean, it's not just births that are impacting not just interest rates, not just housing sales. It is the international migration of folks that come to this community every year in large numbers. Ms. Rivera-Oven.
Thank you for the presentation. One of the things I had a question on is when we're looking at capital improvement plan is geographically, where are these students settling? Where is the growth in the county when it comes to either the international students or the ones who are born here? Where are we seeing that growth?
And that is a great question. As part of the CIP, the enrollment team looks at the effects of every school, every cluster. We have seen trends in different areas, pockets of the county that may attribute more to international, may attribute more to housing turnover or development. But we do look at it from those trends to look at what's happening. I can't answer today exactly where this year's international student enrollment will be headed, but that's something we can certainly come back and show you the trends over time of our different clusters, our different schools impacted more than others based on different factors associated with our enrollment.
Because I think it's important to know where there's also development going on versus certain areas. The Up County is a perfect example where we're seeing a lot of new development, young families, new families, right? And then we're seeing growth, at least in the Damascus area. There's affordability of housing. So I think it would be really helpful to have an idea, not just with international students, but in overall, where is that growth and how that is going to impact the local schools in those communities, because we know that they do have an impact. And we start seeing, a lot of the portals being added and so on. So I think it's important to kind of just see where the trends are to kind of, look overall where we need to also make some improvements, or where we need to kind of be aware that that's coming, coming down the pike, in order to be able to kind of localize and see what schools will need eventually a little bit more support.
Oh, and absolutely, I think that's one of the strong partnerships that's come out of our work over time has been with the county's planning office, really overlaying a lot of the different GIS maps associated with growth, development, turnover. Other important things too, though, I would say, is that you mentioned things like portable classrooms. One of the things that we are seeing, obviously, this has been a trend over time, but Blueprint, other factors, portable classrooms, come into the system not purely for enrollment these days, right? Programming, Title I changes, community school changes necessitate the need for more space in schools. So we're also predicting, what is needed from a space standpoint beyond just enrollment. Enrollment's a big part of it, but the programming piece too. So, so we certainly would love to dive deeper into some of these, but I think we have some great partnerships out there with other agencies that are helping us manage, some of these shifts and changes throughout the county, whether it be development, turnover, socioeconomic impacts, you name it. So I do think the superintendent's recommendation is well positioned to manage sort of a balance of all of it.
Ms. Harris?
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple clarifying questions as I'm looking at slide 6. Our enrollment changes from last year to preliminary this year. And I'm just noticing that by far the largest grade level of increases with 11th graders. It's exponentially more than any other grade level. And I guess I'm assuming a lot of that is newcomer students who are coming to us with their families, or being reunited with families, and are being, as they're being placed in grades, that's where a lot of them are being placed.
Yeah,
Do we know?
Yeah, that's a good question. One we'll dive deeper into. I would say, though, as you get into 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th, there is an aspect of credits too. So students that are going up with their cohorts, if the credits aren't matching up with that grade level, it's showing it maybe an increase in one grade level and not necessarily moving up with the cohort beyond that. But that has been a trend that we see over time in that 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th range is sometimes more to do with credits and how we're identifying students by grade level based on that aspect versus new students coming in, but we can definitely break that down and share that with the board to show them some of those details.
And the other group that we're seeing, significant growth in, which I'm assuming will likely change, is our pre-K special education students. And as you were talking about, Mr. Adams, a lot of when we're talking about facilities, a lot of the nature of the facilities that we need are related to programs. And our pre-K special education students need very specific kinds of facilities. And this goes along, I think, with Ms. Rivera-Oven's questions about where we are currently creating those programs for our pre-K special education students, because they're not in every school. And so are we matching their location with where those students physically are in the county, or trying to?
So, and that's a great question. We will dive a little bit deeper into some of the specific locations, but yes, the partnership with the pre-K and the special ed office to make sure we're aligning space where there's need has been ongoing work for the past several years. From an enrollment perspective, I think this is an important piece too, is that, pre-K is voluntary at this point, right? So predicting how many students will come in for a pre-K program is pretty difficult. Identifying students, in the pre-K range for special education services takes time, and that's something that happens over time throughout the school year. So we see those numbers change, but that's something that, we've been working very closely between operations and the academic side to make sure we're positioning ourselves to be able to serve, as many students as possible in the locations where we see the greatest need. And you will start to see some of that as we get into the nuts and bolts around, specific capital improvements projects.
Thank you.
Mrs. Madrowski?
Not to harp on this particular issue, but Adrian, I feel like you normally know where the biggest amount of growth is and stuff like that. We don't have any kind of indication as to where we're seeing, because around my area, I see all kinds of new development coming up, and I'm like, ooh, our schools are already overcrowded.
So we do know we have information regarding development. I think that the CIP reflects that because we know it's coming or it's there, and those projects that we need. Crown High School, for example.
Right.
The new high school Woodward reopening, for example. So we're seeing that growth in the Down County Consortium, up to 70 in the Gaithersburg area. Further up, of course, Clarksburg. At some point, though, Clarksburg it's always, like we used to say about Rachel Carson Elementary School, is really high and it starts to come down. The same way with Matanaga Elementary School. It exploded, and then over time it came down. So I think that over not too distant in the future, we'll start to see that with Clarksburg. We have the new elementary school. We're going to do the addition and expansion at Damascus to address the overutilization at Clarksburg High School. But that is where we see it. And Bethesda, of course, with their development. So we're seeing it there as well. So we do know, and we have all that information regarding the development, but we also reflect it over time in the CIP, because it doesn't get all built at the same time, and then they all don't move in at the same time, and they all don't have kids at the same time. But it is reflected in the CIP based on the projects that we have.
My concern really is the fact that, and I feel like we've had conversations with the planning board and the county council and stuff about changing this, but I'm not sure if we did ever, but we don't include projections for development that's not completed. Is that correct?
Correct. So the way that we do it is if it's been approved, not in the pipeline, but it's actually been approved, it will be part of our projections. But it will also be part of the projections, again, over time. So if it's a development of 5,000 houses and the student generation rate, which is something that comes from the planning board, not from us, is X, whatever that X number is, then that X number is sort of sprinkled over a number of years. Again, with the assumption they're not all walking in at the exact same time. But we do have that. What we don't have in the projections is if there is a development, but it hasn't been approved yet, because it could be approved in 20 years from now or in 10 years from now. But if it's been approved, it's part of our projections. Could be in the out years of the projections, but it's in the projections.
Okay, so maybe that did change, because I feel like we didn't used to finish it or include it unless it was completely finished. Then I have a silly little question on slide 6 that we were on. Growth/decline, grade to grade. I don't really fully understand what that means, because the numbers don't add up. Like, to me, that would imply the change over the year, 1 year, but the numbers are different.
Yeah, so that's representing the cohort as it moves through. So, so instead of looking at it from what happened in first grade to last year to first grade this year, we look at it from first grade last year to second grade this year, and what changes happen in that cohort as it moves through.
But like looking at 9th grade, for example, we had a decline in that grade. But you're saying that the 2,705 is the difference between 12,088?
No, it's actually,
or 880.
So it's the difference between the 12,234 of last year in 8th grade to the 14,939 of 9th grade of this year. So
Got it.
It's just showing that cohort change.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Just one final question before we move on. This is just K to 12 enrollment. There is another set of numbers for pre-K enrollment. Is that correct?
Well, and back on slide 6, we do break out Head Start pre-K special ed in our enrollment projection as well. So you can see it in that bottom box.
But the 160 includes pre-K? Okay.
Yes, so if you look at again, at slide 6, you'll see that it does include pre-K. All other special ed is in their grade level cohort. It's just pre-K special ed that's pulled out.
So when
They are already included, correct?
we talk about state funding, we often say just K to 12. But, so what?
So that's why, and you can look at, so if you look at slide 6 again, you can see that there is a K-12 number, and then there is, when we include the Head Start pre-K, there is then the total number, pre-K to 12. So we do it both ways.
Thank you. We can continue with the presentation.
Wait, and Carla, I had a question.
Sorry, can't see you. Go ahead.
That's okay. Not to beat a dead horse, but I wanted to go back to the projections for pre-K. When Seth mentioned that, it's hard to project those numbers, but I'm trying to figure out, the blueprint is requiring that you add pre-K. So where is that in all of this discussion? I mean, do we have a set target for this year that we're trying to meet? And if so, will that be spread around the county?
So yes, in the out years, we are projecting the pre-K PEP to grow. We can certainly show you what that projection looks like over time. These first couple of years, and I think we've talked about this at the board table just around blueprint implementation, what that looks like year after year. Right now, what we're showing for next year is really nominal increases, around space availability, changes based on going from part day to full day. And then in the out years, as we start to implement more space opportunities, again, as you'll see in the CIP, then we'll allow more seats, and then obviously then with more seats, we're able to really project out, increases in pre-K PEP moving forward as well. And then Adrian.
So are there no blueprint targets for this year? Is that what you're saying?
Yeah.
There are no specific year-by-year requirements for adding. And so as Mr. Adams mentioned, the first change that we're going to see is moving from these half-day programs to the full-day programs. And then as space becomes available in individual schools, we'll be able to add there. Then the third part will be looking at some of these pre-K centers as that space becomes available. And so it really will be driven by space availability in the out years.
And Ms. Wolf, I just want to add, I think during our May conference, I went to one specifically about pre-K. The state is encouraging community providers to be part, to do part of the provider trend. So that might increase seats in our system, but not within our buildings.
No, I understood that, Julie. My question was really trying to figure out whether the projections included numbers for the blueprint and how many seats will go from half day to full day, because I think that's a big factor as to why people don't enroll in pre-K. They need all day.
Ms. Carmihas, do you have your light on?
So I'm going to go back to the previous question, then I'll answer that one about the projection. So I just, though, do want to make it clear, while we do have the pre-K numbers in the projection, so like the whole numbers for the remaining 6 years, what we did, because we don't know exactly where they're going to go, we almost did just like a line item of those pre-K and PEP students. And so, for example, if you look at an elementary school, you may not see a change, and then you may say, oh, where is the pre-K? Where is the PEP? We have done that line item this year moving forward to make sure that we include the students in the enrollment projections. And as we work with pre-K and the PEP offices, figuring out where those students are coming from, where we need to house them, then each year, those students that we've already put in the projections will then be put into specific schools. So I just want to make sure that people know that we've captured them. We just haven't captured them specifically at a school in the out years of the CIP. And as every year we go through, we will then identify those schools.
Okay. Thank you.
Mr. Verhaven?
So help me out a little bit, because I'm a little bit confused. So we had, this past year, we had over 4,000 plus applications for pre-K. But I think we only had capacity for, and I'm talking about the full day pre-K. So I'm trying to, along the lines of Ms. Wolf, I'm trying to understand the reason that we don't have a higher enrollment is because of space. Because I know, like, at least in my district, we ran into the issue of space. So we had kids who were on a waiting list, and because we don't provide transportation to other schools that have opening, at least with the cases that I had, they were not able to attend pre-K, but it doesn't mean they don't exist. It just means that the school, I'll give you an example, Daily was at capacity of 20 students, and they could have done another class, but there was no space to do an additional class. So I'm trying to see where you're capturing that data, because it's not because we don't have people applying for pre-K, it's because we don't have the space capability to add full-time classrooms for pre-K in some of these cases. So I'm trying to see where, because I think this goes along with the CIP, if we need to build, if we need to add, if we need to assess, right? Where do we capture that? Because we are going to be transitioning into all-day pre-K, and I want us to be prepared when that comes, because as Ms. Wolf said, there's a lot of folks who do not do pre-K now because it's only half a day, and a lot of them are working all day. So it's better to leave them with grandma or with an aunt and so on. So where are we going to capture that?
The demand.
The demand that is going to happen.
So typically, as Mr. Adams said, we do work with the pre-K office the same way we work with special ed. They come to us and they tell us, this is what we need at a certain school, or this is the programs. It may not work at one school because there's no room, and let's say, for example, there's already 10 relocatables. So we work with them and say, does another school work? It is the same way with pre-K. I mean, I'm looking in Appendix L in the CIP, it says how many seats are available for pre-K, and it's 3,200 seats. So it's not necessarily a facility driven, because if we have to, we'll put a relocatable there. The pre-K students won't be in the relocatable, it would be another class, but we can do those pre-K students at those spaces. As we continue with Blueprint, again, we have said, okay, we know that we're going to have to serve these amount of students each year. So we put them in the projection, but we didn't put them at the school because right now we're not sure where they're going to go. We are working, and we continue to work and are having meetings about where those students need to be. And so if it's relocatables because they need to be at a school and there is no room, we will put those relocatables there. If we can modify existing spaces to accommodate them, we will do that as well. So we are working and collaborating with both offices to make sure that those kids, when they arrive, how many arrive, that we will be able to accommodate them.
Why don't we, if we can have Peggy Pugh, Dr. Pugh come down, our Chief Academic Officer, and talk a little bit about, this obviously isn't the pre-K team, and so she can give an update on the pre-K. We're involved, obviously, from a space, to your point,
Right.
from a space and facility standpoint.
That's my interest, because, and I understand the whole relocation thing, right? But I know as it stands right now, when you do relocation, there's no transportation that goes with that relocation. So the transportation has to be done by the parent at this point. So I'm just thinking ahead that we might run into this issue more than once. And if we had this year, over 4,000 applications and only, how many seats were available? 3,200, I think you said, right? Then there is a difference of almost 1,000 kids who were not able then to access pre-K based on what the demand was. So I'm just thinking ahead of the space that we're going to have to create once we go pre-K all day.
So why don't we let Dr. Pugh give kind of a high-level overview, and then if there's specific questions about space, obviously we're still working through that piece.
Just because this is about the CIP, and I don't want us to get deep into
no,
programs,
yeah.
the question was, how are we tracking demand for pre-K?
So we're actually using the state's target of those in 300% poverty. So at this point, we're actually using numbers and determining based on a total cohort of students who may be available a very unscientific way, just using past practice to target, the additional 4,800 seats that we know that we need. Our first step in this long-term project, because it is like building 6 elementary schools really to have the capacity for every student, our first steps are to identify where we have half-day programs and make sure that we're converting those to full-day programs. Where we can work with facilities to meet the need of expanding that, it will be at that same school. At the same time, we have a responsibility for adding seats. And so that's sort of the technical work that's happening right now, looking at school by school and targeting mostly at the beginning our Title I schools, right, which are space constrained in some ways, building into the out years of a CIP where when they have the new schools are arriving and other schools become available, looking at a center model to be able to accommodate more students. So rather than we did a very, we did a mathematical formula for how we might do this in year over year, but understanding initially we don't have large spaces to put in a pre-K center, and we actually think it's best to have it attached to the school. So we're working with facilities to attach them to the schools where possible, understanding where we might put centers to serve larger groups of students to be able to meet that, to serve all students who are at the 300% of poverty. At the same time, working with the county to build up the infrastructure so that there are private providers who can access this funding from the state and overcome some of the barriers that are there for them to be able to build their capacity. So we have met at their house at least 4 or 5 times to try and make sure that we're accommodating and setting up and planning for the needs.
But sort of just to be clear, though, there are physical constraints, right? I mean, when we look at some of the areas where you could see 200, 300 students in the pre-K or PEP, we don't have that kind of room at all of our facilities. That's why we are really doing a strategic look. Are there closed schools? We've talked about this strategy of retaining, bringing back closed schools back into the MCPS inventory and being very strategic about where they're located, how we can use them in the future. But to your point, though, if some of these centers aren't necessarily located in the exact neighborhood that we need, at some point down the road, we are going to have to look at, what other operational services would be involved in this. But there are physical constraints. So, and that's the work that's gone in so far, is just to make sure we can find a balance between what we have, what we can provide, and then where we have to look at in the future.
Okay, if we can proceed with the presentation.
All right, well, I think if we're done with the questions on enrollment, we'll shift to the next topic, and Ms. Karamijas will take over and walk us through that.
So if you could bring up the slides. Oh, I'm sorry. You bring up the next slide, please. So this section is a lot of numbers. So I'm going to just walk through them, and then, if there are questions, we do have an opportunity at the end, but if there's something immediate or something that isn't clear when I'm going through it, please just let me know. So the top table, I just want to do a little history. So the top table was the Board of Education's request last year, the amended 23 to 28 CIP. It was $1.936 billion. The county executive's recommendation, his recommendation always comes out in the second week of January, was $1.843 billion for the 6 years. There were 2 there was a second, he came out with a second amendment that is included in that. So the total difference between the county executive's recommendation and the board's request was $93 million. MCPS did provide non-recommended reductions. We actually did 2 non-recommended reductions based on the county executive's recommendation to align with it. We did reductions as well as technical adjustments. The county council's adopted CIP did include all of those technical adjustments, but no delays to projects. And as Dr. McKnight mentioned, that was accomplished because of the increase in the recordation tax. That recordation tax premium that was approved by the county council actually enabled our CIP to basically go forward. There was a difference of $30 million, and that was taken care of with just technical adjustments, moving expenditures from different fiscal years. So at the end, you can see the adopted CIP for MCPS was $1.905 billion for the 6 years. Next slide. So how the CIP is funded, and I actually haven't brought this slide in a couple of years. I thought that it would be really helpful because we do have a lot of changes to the funding sources that we typically get. Bonds is the big one. Bonds are determined by spending affordability guidelines, which is the largest revenue source for our CIP. State aid, which is determined by state formula based on eligible projects approved in the CIP. If there are projects that are recommended, they will not be reflected in the state CIP. It must be approved, the project must be approved first by the county council to then be recommended for state funding. School impact tax is the tax that's collected at the time of a building permit. So that's about building construction prior to it actually being completed. Recordation tax is about the sale of existing homes. And we receive the majority of that recordation tax. A portion of it goes to Montgomery College, but the majority goes to us. And then current revenue. Years ago, we had a handful of projects that must be funded with current revenue. And this is the same funding source that, of course, funds the operating budget. Today, we only have 3 projects that have current revenue. Technology modernization is one of them. Our relocatable classrooms is the second. And facility planning has a portion that has current revenue. It also does have bonds as well. Next slide, please. So again, I know there's a lot of numbers on this chart, but I did sort of box ones that I thought were really the point and what we're going to be looking at. So the first column tells you the fiscal year, what CIP cycle it was. The second column is the county's total, and this is about bonds, our GO bonds, what's available. So I'm just going to go through the first line, and then of course we can look through all the rest. But if you see back in the 2025 to 2015 to 2020 CIP, the total SAG appropriation, the spending affordability guidelines, available bonds countywide was $1.9 billion for the 6-year CIP. The way the SAG is approved, it's a 1-year total, the first 2 years, and then a 6-year total. So the out years are sort of like placeholders. It's the first 2 years that are approved by the county council, and then the 6-year total. So you can see that first red box, we received $796 million of those 1.947 billion bonds that were available. And if you go all the way to the end, the very last column, it'll say what the difference is from the year before. So I actually put in, because I didn't do the year before, but it was we received 41% of those bonds in that fiscal year, in the 2015 to 20 CIP. If you look at the second year, and so this just goes down, looks every year what the county approved in their bonds for the county, what we received as the total, and then the last 2 columns, what the difference is year by year, a dollar amount, and the percentage. And that's really important because if you look at the third column, the one that says the difference, the county total, you can see year by year what the increase what the decrease was, or if it did not change. So again, if you look at the 15 to 20 amended versus the 15 to 20 approved, there was an increase of $52 million. It went from 1.947 to 1.999 billion. So that's how you read it. So for example, in the 17 to 22 amended versus the 19 to 24 CIP, you could see there was a decrease. The amended 22 was 2 billion, and then it dropped to 1.8. If you then look at the end of the chart, you can see how that impacted MCPS. So again, we lost our portion of bonds was reduced by $21 million, then it was reduced by 61, then by 55, and you can see in the 2021 to 2026 CIP, it was reduced by over $100 million in bonds. So again, those last 2 years show in dollars what we either gained or lost in that CIP year, and the percentage. So again, if you look at the top, you can see in the 2015 to 20 CIP, we were getting 41% of the bonds, the county total bonds. If you look at the last year, this past approved, the amended 23 to 28, we are at 29%. So you can see that drop. It's significant. Even if you look at the total, again, if you're looking at the second column, the county total, they went from a high of 2 billion in bonds, what's available overall to the county. We are now at 1.68 billion. And again, you can see where those drops are. The other thing that's interesting when I did this comparison is that over the course of the 10 years, or 12 years, the total change for the county, the difference, again, that third column was 267 million. So that change from the 15 to 20 to the amended 23 to 28 was 267. So the county dropped their bonds by that amount. When you look at the last two columns, and you look at that bolded blue, the bolded black for us, for MCPS, that reduction was 303 million. So not only did, you can look at it, not only did we sort of take the reduction whole for the county, that 267, but on top of it, our bonds dropped by yet another $33 million.
You're going to go into what causes this, right, in the next slide?
Well, it's county council action, what causes it, but I do have additional slides, and then again, if there's questions, we can go through it. So why don't we go to the next slide, because this is a graphical way to look at it. So you can see over that same period what the county bonds were approved over time, how they have been reduced, and the red line indicates the portion that we have received and the reduction. Now, there have been some upticks a little bit, but again, if you're looking from beginning to end, what that reduction is. We were in the 2015 to 20, 796. We are now in the approved 493 million. Okay, next slide.
Wait, can I just really quickly?
Clarifying.
Clarify,
She
yeah.
might cover it in.
Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yes. No, I just for those of us who, this is a lot to take on. And I just like very plain, lame terms. Like if I was talking to the lady that does my nails and explained to her this, because she asked me about Rockville High School, how come blah, blah, blah. So what is the point here? Because it looks like, I know you said this is county council action.
Why don't we finish the
But
slide?
can you keep that in mind?
A summary at the end, so
Okay.
it says what this means for us and what it
Yes.
sort of is the point.
Okay.
As soon as I get through the funding sources, but the bottom line, sort of one sentence is, the less bonds available, the less projects we can do. That's sort of the bottom line.
But is it less bonds available to the whole county or just to MCPS?
So both, if you think about it, right? So if there is a pot, we always talk about this with state aid, right? If there's a pot of money and the pot of money gets smaller, county government, transportation, police, libraries, HHS, all of that gets reduced. It is interesting, that chart that I do have, though, you could see the percentage for us has also been reduced. So if we would have kept our, for example, just kept our percentage of that high, even though the number has been reduced, we still would have been receiving more bonds. But because the bonds have been reduced and our percentage has been reduced, it is even a further impact on the projects that we can do.
That's what I was trying to clarify, is whether or not we were getting a smaller percentage because the bonds were reduced, or as, like, you know, with the fact that the bonds were reduced.
Right, and so what happens is there are other, again, we are a large county with lots of different needs, and so those bonds, because they have been reduced, you know, again, there's only so much in the pot to then be divvied out to colleges, all of the agencies.
Ms. Harris?
Sorry, this is just a clarifying question for me on slide 19. And again, just looking for plain language, the very last column on the far right. So it says percent difference, but to me, isn't that actually the percentage of the county's total GO bonds in a given year that is allocated to MCPS?
Yes, it should, yes, you are correct. It should say percentage received, or as opposed to difference, yes.
Okay, all right, that was it. Thank you.
Yes, I had that difference year to year, and I unfortunately just carried the word difference to the following, but it is the percentage. It is the percentage that we receive.
Thank you for.
Thank you. I will fix that.
Okay, let's continue.
So if we can go back to the slides, I think we're on next slide, please. One more. Thank you. So this, again, is just another way to show it. This is about, though, MCPS. So if you look again at the top of the chart, you can see in the, and it goes even further up, 2025 to 2010 CIP, the spending affordability guidelines was 1.14 billion. Over the years, you can see an increase, and I put a purple square around as high as it was. In the 17 to 22 amended CIP, it was as high as 2.04 billion. And this is county, not ours, what we received, but the county. This is what was approved for spending affordability guidelines. After that, you can see the decline. We went from 1.86, so there's no change, down to 1.7, 1.7, and for the last 3 budget cycles, we're at 1.68 billion. So there has been no change in the approved spending affordability guidelines countywide for these 3 past fiscal years. And so, you know, the bullets that I put to the left is sort of just an explanation. You know, they approved, the county council approved 280, and remember I said they do approve the first 2 years of the 6-year period and then the 6-year total. So they approved for 25 and 26, 280 million. They did that just it was like 3 weeks ago, I think. It was the first week of October, with a 6-year total of that 1.68 billion, again, the same as the 2 previous cycles. And it will impact our CIP. As that number does get smaller, as our percentage gets smaller, it does affect our CIP because bonds was the largest funding source for us on the capital side. Now, I just want to say that come February, because this is an on year of the CIP, they do have an opportunity to change that amount. They can lower it by any amount, but they can only increase it by a total of 10%.
And I just want to say too, the spending affordability is sort of a general, it's sort of an indicator of the fiscal health of the county. You know, and you know, I think you'll hear a lot of conversations over time between what the county executive may recommend or thinks is appropriate for for SAG and then ultimately what county council votes to approve on. But it is a good indicator of what the county revenues look like. And this obviously, while it's not impacting operating budget, you can just see, the discussions and the votes on spending affordability is that general idea of what is the overall health of the county, what do our revenues look like, what are the opportunities for the tax base to bring in additional dollars. All those types of things are sort of rolled up into this SAG or spending affordability piece. So I just want to put that out there in terms of like if you're in a conversation about what is the fiscal health, what are the opportunities, this usually is a pretty good indicator of what's going on.
And just because we do hear this when we speak to our counterparts at the county and at the council, debt affordability, so those bonds have to be paid off. They're like a mortgage. It's no different. And that debt, of course, is a current revenue because that's how they're paid off. And it does compete with all operating budgets. So there is conversations and there is a connection between the bonds that are approved and that debt affordability. So I don't want to leave that out because I know that will be a conversation.
Would that be the AAA bond rating deficit?
Correct. And I believe at one point that debt was I think the highest sort of piece of the operating pie. I don't know if that is still the case.
Okay, let's proceed.
Okay. So if we look at the next slide, I think we're going to start, if you can go to the next slide, we're now going to talk about state aid. So currently, we receive state aid actually from 3 different sources. It used to be only 1, then it became 2, and with Build to Learn, it is actually 3. So the first one is our annual allocation. It's what we request from the state. The IAC, the Interagency Commission on School Construction, approves that allocation. The second one is back in 2015, it was approved by the General Assembly to include this enrollment growth and relocation classroom. We call it EGRC funding, that if you qualify, you receive this additional funds for schools that are growing and have relocatable classrooms. The third one is the Build to Learn, which was approved back in 2020. It was an additional pot of funds that we were able to access in order to address our capital improvements program. The BTL funding, it was determined when the legislation was approved, the amount for MCPS was approximately $460 million that could be spent over a 10-year period. However, due to inflation, that number has actually been reduced to $357 million. We have already been approved for, based on projects that we have requested through the BTL funding, $267 million, which then means it only leaves $887 million left in that pot of money. So when we think about what's available, we have had a very large infusion of capital dollars or state funding because of Build to Learn. Once that goes away, everything will sort of go back to the way it was prior to Build to Learn. And I can show that. If go to the next slide.
Why is it going away? It's done.
Well, because the legislation, right, has already, that is the pot, that is what has been allocated. The only way that it can sort of come back is if that all, if the legislation, if it starts all over again saying, okay, let's do this amount of money. That was a big push over a handful of years to get that additional funding. But that is a funding, and different counties use that money differently.
It's not recurring?
No.
For 10 years?
10 years, but we have already spent well over the majority of those dollars.
It's a good topic for the delegates breakfast to talk about, what is but just to remind everyone, this was introduced as part of, the casino revenues, and it was introduced over a 10-year period, but there was an idea that at some point at the end of the 10 years, we would revisit and see what opportunities look like in the future. So again, a great topic to bring up as we get closer to using up those funds.
And when's the 10-year?
2030.
Right. And we are way ahead. we have money that's in the CIP now, in our CIP request, that brings us down to that 87 million. We have middle schools, elementary schools, all in the CIP that easily could use those dollars. So by 2026, 2027 at the latest, my assumption is those dollars, the initial dollars will be gone.
And it has been very helpful to us. We are very grateful for the funding.
Next slide. So I just wanted to show sort of, nope, if you could go back one. So in this slide, I just wanted to show, in the past, the way that the county would use the state aid as a funding source for our 6-year CIP, they would just put in what we actually got in that fiscal year, because usually the IAC approves the amount, the allocation, by like the first week of May. So I was always able to get it into the CIP. And then the out years of the CIP would be assumptions. That is the way the council did it. And they never put it in, or the county executive's office and the county council sort of combined, they would not assume state aid in a project. They would just have this sort of line item that said state aid reconciliation, but they wanted to assume it, which made sense because each year we do receive state aid. Ever since Built, they've actually, Built to Learn and the additional dollars that we've had, they've actually put it in to specific projects. Even if we haven't requested those projects yet, there is an assumption that those projects will be funded. And so we're in a little different place than we were a handful of years ago. And so I also wanted, so this slide sort of, I wanted to describe that, but I also wanted to show the increase in assumption, partly because of Built to Learn and those additional dollars, but even in the out years, there is a large assumption of state aid. And so if you look at the first line, the 21 to 26, you could see the 6 years, and we'll just do the 6-year total. For state aid is 432 million. For the amended CIP, it went up just a little bit to 448. And the black font, is what was actually received. So again, in the first year, in the 2026, you could see 54 is what we actually were allocated. In the amended, you could see the 54 again, and then the second year of the CIP were actually allotted, appropriated 68 million. The ones that are in orange are those assumptions for the out years. If you look at the second part of the table, the 23 to 28 CIP, the first on year of our last year's CIP cycle, that increase of $566 million. So you're talking about almost over $100 million assumed in those out years. The first year is what we knew we were getting, what was approved, and then what the assumptions are. So if you compare, you can see those assumptions are higher than what was assumed in the out years the previous CIP cycle. In the amended CIP, you can see it went up yet again to 585 million. You can see in 2024 is what we received, and that is also a little bit of an assumption. And then from 25 to 28 is what the assumption is. So if you look at FY25, the year that we are working with now, the assumption of state aid is $158 million. It is a combined of the annual allocation, the EGRC, and the Built to Learn, but there is a large assumption there. And so, do you want
to? Well, no, so we're sort of putting the pieces together here, but you can see the bond dollars are coming down. And if the assumption, if the actuals is less than the assumption, that further basically says less that we can do within our capital improvements program. So we just, we're going to show you the assumptions that the county is making on the state aid. We're going to show you some assumptions on the next ones around recordation tax, but you're going to see the theme here is assumptions are higher than actuals, and that's likely to impact our CIP as we're moving forward.
And I just want to point out, I sort of talked about the first two bullets under that table, but the third one is really important. So for FY25, the IAC voted to freeze the CIP funding targets to the FY23 amounts, which was $280 million. For MCPS, our allocation would be about $50 million for FY25. So again, if you look at that FY25 assumption number, it is a large number. Again, though, I just do want to point out that the way the county is doing it, they are assuming dollars in projects. But whether we would be able to hit that target of 158, now again, they have divvied out what was already approved, again, not necessarily in that fiscal year, but in beyond. But it will take, again, if we cannot make that assumption, it is another concern of how those dollars would be made up in that fiscal year, because that state aid may not be available.
Mr. Adams, you wanted to?
Yeah, and I think just one clarifier, so the assumptions we're talking about, we don't make the assumptions. When the county executive puts his budget together based on your request, the Office of Management and Budget put together the assumptions as part of his request, and then that's what the county council is using to be able to basically approve a capital improvements program. So the assumptions are out of our hands, but we want to show you basically what those assumptions have been, and not to raise major red flags, but there are some red flags in terms of what ultimately is going to be affordable moving forward.
And I just want to clarify, not only the assumptions, but all the funding sources are not from us. If, for example, in the superintendent's recommendation, there are 3 projects that are new. Those projects, when we do our PDFs, our project description forms, I initially put them in, the funding source is GO bonds. Once the county executive comes out with his recommendation and then the county council eventually approves theirs, those funding sources may change. But it is not us that decides those funding sources, project by project. It is the county executive's office of Management and Budget, along with working with the county council staff.
Mr. Rivera.
So I'm trying to follow the logic. Is there any kind of talk between OMG and us? Because you're saying the assumptions are made by the county executive and so on too. But if they look at the assumptions and they're not hitting the mark, why are they assuming that we're going to be getting more when we actually, in reality, that has not been the pattern? But is there like talks between us and them in order to make more realistic assumptions? Because the folks that, we know what our projections are, what we need, what the superintendent, the 3 projects are. So is there ever a point before those assumptions are made where there's actually talks between us and them?
So state aid, I think, is one that is more collaborative. Recordation tax, impact tax, GO bonds is really on their side of the street to make those decisions based upon what the needs are, what the county executive's recommendation wants to be, what he wants to fund. The state aid, we do have conversations, and again, like I said, it used to be that they had one project, one PDF that would just have assumptions. They have now put in state aid by project, and they have taken, let's say, for example, a project that receives $40 million in state aid in 1 year, let's say in 24, they have taken that $40 million and have spread it over a number of years. So that assumption in 25, depending on what we get from the state, may be an okay assumption based upon how they now reflect the state aid that is received. But it is a large number from what we have seen in the past. that being said, we do have a number of big projects. So we do have Northwood that we received money for. We will have Crown in there. Woodward, we've already received money for. We do have a number of other capital projects. So it is hard to know now whether that assumption will actually hold, but it is a difference from the way that they have done how they have allocated the state aid. And when you're looking at bonds, so again, looking at the total picture, if those bonds are going down and that state aid doesn't come to fruition, even if it's $10 million, what does that mean? Where do we go then? What would replace it? And if not, then what does that mean for our CIP, which it would mean then delays and deferrals of projects. So we do communicate, though. We have had numerous meetings with the County Executive's Office of Management and Budget staff, and we do share with them what we're looking at projects, what those percentages may be for new projects, so that they can make those assumptions.
Thank you.
Okay? So next slide, I think. So I think we can go to the next slide. So recordation tax, this is the third one that we have seen a pretty significant change. And at one point, the county was selling houses, right? They stayed on the market for less than 24 hours and they were sold, people were buying. But as we have said, even as it has affected potentially our enrollment projections, recordation tax has been affected as well. So again, if you look at the 21 to 26 CIP, the 6-year total for recordation tax was $393 million for MCPS. The recordation tax for the 23 to 28 CIP was $581 million. That's, again, an increase of almost $200 million over the 6-year CIP, just shy of $200 million. In the amended CIP, our approved CIP now, we started off with a recordation tax of $389 million. And this is what was in the county executive's recommendation. Again, how to fund our CIP along with the rest of the county and their CIPs. As we know, and as we talked about in the beginning, there was a premium that was recommended and approved by the county council to add to, and it's basically our CIP, add to our CIP in order to fund it. And you can see, so with the 388 that was already approved, plus the premium of 135, our recordation tax for the 6 years, and all of those assumptions in the out years are part of our CIP, you can see is $524 million. It is actually not as high, and that's what that difference is, as what was in the 23 to 28 CIP. So it has already come down, even with that premium. We are still lower than what we were, what the funding source, what's available to us, is even lower than what was in the 23 to 28 CIP. Again, another piece of that, of our funding puzzle. The couple of bullets, just the amount is based on actuals collected for that first year, and then there is a projection. It does get revised if they see that they're not getting in or got in what they assumed to get in from the year before. Without that premium, again, there would have been a shortfall between our CIP and what was actually collected. And you can see what that shortfall would have been. I mean, that's a pretty big number of about $135 million. So without that, something would have had to occur, whether or not we would have gotten another funding source to infuse into our CIP, or whether our CIP would have had to been reduced. Next slide. So sort of what does this all mean? And I thought that this was a pretty helpful slide. Again, graphs are always helpful. The 21 to 26 amended CIP compared to the 23 to 28 CIP. So comparing both, they're both amended years. 2 years ago versus what we are in now, the FY24, which is the amended CIP. And you can see clearly, if you look at the table on the left, the GO bonds that was available to us was 34% of our CIP, not 34, the 34% is not county, it is our CIP, how our CIP gets funded with these different funding sources. So 34% of our CIP was funded with bonds. If you look at the other graph, where we are now in the amended, 26% is funded with GO bonds. If you look at the recordation tax on the left, 24% recordation tax is used to fund our CIP. If you look on the right, you have to, and I actually did it intentionally. I left the recordation tax and then had the premium right next to it. If you combine the two, that's 28%. That's a 4% difference. If you look at the state aid on the left, it's 28% was the portion of our total CIP. It is now 31% of our total CIP. So there is clearly a reduction and change over time between, again, what is assumed, because it's an actual and assumed, because it's a 6 years, of bonds, and the three that are the big ones are bonds, recordation tax, and state aid. Impact tax, school impact tax has stayed relatively the same, as well as current revenue. So we have, between those 2 years, our bonds have been reduced, and our recordation tax and state aid have increased, have been assumed an increase and have increased.
Can you restate what current revenue means?
Sure. Current revenue is the same dollars funding that comes from the operating budget. It is current. It's actually taxes. It's just property taxes. We have 3 projects in our CIP that need to be funded with current revenue that cannot be funded with bonds. Again, that's tech mod, facility planning, and relocatables. So it's just a very small portion. It competes with the operating budget, so the less amount that we have, the better overall, because those dollars then would compete with the operating budget.
Go ahead.
Next slide. And so here's the summary. So the summary is, over the past 10 years, GO bonds available for the MCPS CIP have been reduced. State aid assumptions for the out years of the CIP have increased over the past 3 budget cycles. BTL funds, which account for part of that increase, which is legitimate because of that large infusion of CIP, of funds, will end, and the only available state funding will be the annual allocation. The recordation tax assumptions include the premium for the 6 years, so that is already included in the 6 years, in the approved 6 years. And then finally, any shortfalls in funding assumptions would need to be supplemented with bonds, or projects would need to be delayed or deferred. I think this is the last slide. Next slide, please. Yes.
And just one final point as we look at all of this cheery news about reduced revenue coming in. As we've talked about at this table before, we're also seeing significant increase in costs ongoing, and so we're really being squeezed from both ends.
Can you, I think you mentioned it, the council has an opportunity to revise the
Spending affordability guidelines.
That's in February?
It's in February. Because we are in an on year, they approve it in October, and then they come back in February. They do look at all the revenue that's going on. It's not sort of made in a vacuum. They do look at the recordation tax, what's going on in the country. They look at a number of fiscal factors to make a decision whether or not they want to reduce it, and they can reduce it by any amount, or they can increase it by a maximum of 10%.
Okay. Any questions from my colleagues? Remember, this is a lot of information. We do have work sessions, so if you think of a question after this meeting, well, we're not going to be covering all of these 3 areas. It's perfectly fine to bring it up during a work session in the coming days. I did have a question about the last section of the presentation, more for our demographer. There was a story in the Washington Post about homeschooling, and it says that in the state of Maryland, homeschooling has gone back to pre-pandemic levels. Is that what we're seeing here? How is homeschooling information captured? In addition to private school enrollment? Mr. Adams, do you want to?
So come on up, Robin.
Sorry. Good morning. So we do get a report about homeschool and withdrawals and entries periodically. We get them from the Office of Shared Accountability. They track, no, our in-house MCPS. The numbers that we've seen, yes, during COVID, during the 2021 school year and the 21-22 school year, we did see a lot of withdrawals to homeschooling. We started to see them come back during 21, and then definitely they were coming back during the 22-23 school year. And this year is definitely seems to be more consistent to what we saw beforehand. The homeschooling, let's see, just looking at, I have in front of me the fiscal 23 and fiscal 22 numbers, and we see the net change for homeschooling. We lost in 23, 31 students. In 22, that number was 219. That's a net change. So we get students who come back into the system from homeschooling. We send students out to homeschooling.
So in summary, it's gone back to pre-pandemic.
It appears to be coming back to a pre-pandemic level, yes.
Great. And do you have information about private school enrollment?
Mm-hmm. The same report gives us information about students who are coming in from public schools, from private schools, or going, it's entry and withdrawal, from foreign schools to institutions with special programming, and people who leave the system for other than graduation. So there's several different codes. But it's all through the Office of Shared Accountability.
Okay. If you could share that with the board, I think that would be helpful.
Certainly.
Thank you. Ms. Harris?
Yeah, just a kind of a clarifying question. I believe that some of the state aid, it's not without strings, right? It comes with requirements and restrictions, so that, for instance, I think Built to Learn, that those funds can only be spent on projects using prevailing wage. So what are some of those restrictions on the use of state aid? How are we including that in our calculus of the resources available there and how we will be using them?
Sure. So, the question around what are the provisions around Built to Learn? Built to Learn is different than the rest of the funding sources. Built to Learn is administered by the Maryland Stadium Authority. Maryland Stadium Authority, basically floats their own bonds and then administers the projects based on that. So they've set up basically, a list of criteria of what needs to happen, how it needs to get approved. The board also will be seeing a memorandum of understanding around just how those funds come into the system, and then obviously how they go to the county here shortly. But you are correct. The Stadium Authority has asked that all projects be constructed, using prevailing wage. But what has also happened is that there are additional criteria allow us to get more funding for a Built to Learn project than a traditional state aid project. Built to Learn funds through our legislation actually allow us to receive up to 150% of what traditional state aid we would get for some of our projects. And that's really important. So we've been very strategic around which projects go through the Built program so that we can maximize the state aid. But you are correct. There's some provisions associated with it. And actually, we'll talk about that in the next section, just around what are we seeing from numbers and what are the opportunities moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank you. So if there's no other questions, let's move on to the plan for the next few.
All right, well, we're gonna dive right in, and Ms. Shibasaki was going to walk us through the recommendation. I'm going to add a few pieces here and there just around what we're seeing, some current events that actually just came up late last week, early yesterday, that we'll walk through as well. But Ms. Shibasaki.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So the FY25 is the first year of biannual CIP review process. As Dr. McKnight explained at the beginning, that this recommended CIP will be receive a full review by the county executive and the county council during the coming month, and through the Montgomery County's council's final action on this FY 2025 through 2030 CIP in late May of next year. And also, as Dr. McKnight mentioned, that superintendent recommended FY 2025 capital budget and the CIP program totals $1.999 billion for the 6-year period. And this is an increase of $93.6 million over the approved CIP. And this recommended CIP will address the growing needs for the classroom spaces through addition or new schools. And this will be focusing on aging facilities and infrastructure through the major capital project program and many countywide systemic projects as well. Next slide, please. So this recommended CIP includes a total of 22 capital projects, and 9 of them at high school level, 3 of them at the middle school levels, and 10 of them at the elementary school levels. And this recommendation maintains the completion dates of all previously approved capital projects, with the exception of 4 that requires 1-year extension of the approved construction timeline, and we're going to discuss about this later. And then also this recommendation includes additional funding for the following items. The 3 previously approved capital projects, the replacement of Burtonsville Elementary School, Joan Lelek Elementary School at Broad Acres replacement, and Damascus High School major capital project. They are all reflect escalation of the construction cost. And also there will be 3 new addition projects. One is Mill Creek Town Elementary School to address the overutilization, and James Hubert Blake High School and Paint Branch High Schools as well. And then there will be 5 new major capital projects. One is Eastern Middle School, which will include the planning and the construction funds, and 4 elementary schools, Cold Springs, Damascus, Twinbrook, and Whetstone Elementary Schools. And this will be included in the full planning funds, and we put the placeholder for the construction fund. And it's because we don't know the exact magnitude of the cost of the construction at the time when we do the construction. So we just put the placeholder construction fund. Next slide.
And that's an important piece just around the placeholder funds. You know, again, we don't want to fill up our CIP with higher dollar values than we think we may need. So the idea here is with these projects, as we go through the planning process, we'll refine those budgets. Some may go up, some may come down based on what we see, but we didn't want to go in with a really high placeholder value and then basically clog up artificially the CIP moving forward. You're likely to hear a little bit about that as we go through the process, particularly from the county executive's office. There's this desire to add more money and predict, but for us, it really makes sense not to sort of clog up the CIP, add extra money for things that we may or may not need in the future. So that's important. The other piece to it being placeholders, we did not identify completion dates for those 4 elementaries. Eastern obviously does have a completion date because it has construction funds. For those 4 elementaries, they currently don't have completion dates. But what they do have is the planning funds that will allow us to start design. And when we come back for the following CIP, based on the design of those projects, then set completion dates along with the final construction dollars for each of those 4 projects. So just wanted to highlight that from those 4 pieces.
Are you going to explain the placeholders further?
Yeah, well, the placeholders are, we looked at, I think it was in the neighborhood of about 25 to 30 million for each one of those elementary schools. The idea is that a full tear down or rebuild may be in the 45, 50 million range today. Market conditions hopefully will bring that down a little bit, or some of the scope review may bring that down. So rather than put in $50 million for an elementary school, we're putting 25 or 30 in there. And then, if we have to add a little bit, or it is going to be about the same, it'll essentially move forward from that standpoint. But we didn't want to go from 0 because we didn't want to add, full 50 million at the next CIP, but we also didn't want to have 50 in there, artificially increase our CIP, and then obviously take away if we did not need it.
And what does the county executive want you to do?
There's a desire to add the highest maximum dollar amount. And so, and the reason being is that the higher the dollar amount, it allows OMB in the out years to better plan maybe transportation projects or other aspects, road transit that could start in 2 or 3 years from now. But for us, again, we feel like that is a budgeting process that they can work through. We're going to be very upfront about what our projects are, how they look, what we think they ultimately may happen. We'll keep them up to speed as we go through the design process. But it just doesn't make sense to go from a $1.99 billion budget to, let's say, $2.2 billion just because we want to increase placeholders. Or just because we want to assume or guess what these project costs may be in 2, 3, 4, 5 years from now.
And this is similar to what we used to do with the RevX program and the modernization program. We had that long list of projects. The first handful had actual dollars because we were already into design or even finished design. We knew what the projects would cost. And then the rest of them just had placeholder dollars. So again, when you're coming back, you're not adding $500, $600, $700 million. You may only be adding $100 or $200 million. And that's the similar point here, is that we're sort of treating it, even though there's only a handful, because we don't have that long list anymore, but we wouldn't have to come back in 2 years and add that much more, along with everything else or other things that may be added to the next CIP.
But wouldn't we have to add less if we requested more? And we put higher placeholders into our budget, and then if it ends up costing us less than we had anticipated, we could, put the money, give the money back or whatever, but move it on to different years. But
the idea too is that it didn't seem to make sense to us to add additional money as placeholders and then only come back and pull them out as non-recommended reductions. Again, this idea that there's only so much money in the county pot of dollars, knowing that if we're going to exceed that with just placeholder increases, what sense does it make to increase them, to the highest level possible, and then just back them out over non-recommended reductions anyway? So, I think just really looking at it from a perspective of what kind of money is there, try to plan the best we can and be flexible and nimble as best we can, but not overburden the CIP with just placeholder dollars.
But then don't we always end up having to make non-recommended reductions anyways?
We're hopeful we don't, but that's why we're.
But we always do. I'm just saying.
Last year, I think I just would point out, though, is while we had to come up with non-recommended reductions, the council did not accept any of the non-recommended reductions. So, the superintendent's recommendation and ultimately your request was well aligned with what the county could afford. And that's a very similar strategy of what we're doing this year as well.
Okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, going back to the slide. So for this CIP recommendation includes additional funding to implement the blueprints for Maryland Future, as we just had a discussion about this pre-K and PEP. So through this capital solution, we are planning to install in some relocatable classrooms at the existing elementary school sites, or the construction of the new standalone center, as Dr. Pugh was explaining. Or we can do the capital improvements to do some renovation to the former closed schools. And there are all those, we have those possibilities. And also the CIP recommendation include addressing the system-wide needs by increasing systemic project such as roof replacement project or pillar project. And also it includes a substantial increase of the HVAC replacement project to address the continued backlog through the upgrade or replacement of the systems that is way beyond their expected service life. And also this CIP recommendation includes a new countywide project that is called Healthy School. This is provide to matching fund for the state Healthy School Facility Fund program, and to address HVAC, plumbing, and the roofing systems to improve the learning environment at the school throughout the county.
And this last piece is a new program for us. It was sort of meshed into some existing programs. We felt it was really important for our students, our communities, to see which specific projects are being focused on our indoor air quality efforts, our safe drinking water endeavors, and then obviously to get as much state funding through that initiative as possible. We thought this was a good breakout from some of the other approaches in the past.
Go ahead.
Next slide, please. So as we all have heard so many times, but the effect of COVID-19 pandemic is still unprecedented increase to the material prices, disruption in the supply chain, and labor and staffing shortages, and that will continue to impact the CIP, especially the construction timeline. And as a result, as previously mentioned, the recommended CIP includes a one-year construction extension of the construction timeline for the following four capital project to align with the completion date. And the recommended completion of the August 2027 for Damascus High School, Northwood High School, and Charles W. Woodward High School. And then recommended completion of the August 2026 for Joanne Lelek Elementary School at Broad Acres.
Yeah, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this because obviously, changes in completion dates are not something that we take lightly. What we, I think as we shared with the board, the elementary schools that we opened this past summer were probably some of the most difficult from a timeline perspective. Many of them opened, and as you toured, many of them opened with work that wasn't quite finished. We still had to work with students came back. There was aspects that were very challenging from cost. There was aspects that were challenging from just moving into the facilities. That was a much later process. And what we learned is a lot of those projects weren't necessarily impacted from just the timeline. They were impacted from across the board, the changes that are associated with how supplies come in, how vendors produce materials, when we need to order, when things are ultimately coming in. So as we looked into this, we've been working closely with our construction community around what's the realistic impact. The last thing we want to do is to move forward with a completion date and then have to change midstream or at the end because we're experiencing delays or contractors aren't able to supply the goods or build as fast as we've predicted. And that's what we're seeing recommendations come back. And I'm going to focus in mostly on Northwood because Damascus certainly has not started. We're in the middle of design. Northwood we're at the end of the design. The bids just came in last week. So we're navigating some of the challenges associated with that. But the feedback during that bid process for Northwood was from one of the largest builders in the Mid-Atlantic East Coast was that the contractors were not willing to provide the manpower for a 2-year construction project, and the vendors were not willing to commit to providing the materials and goods on the timelines that we were showing from a schedule standpoint. And that this builder recommended that for continuity of our operations to move from a 2-year to a 3-year construction period. And so that's what's being recommended for Northwood. And I would just say a 2-year was an aggressive timeline before COVID. 2-year in today's world, yes, it's almost, in some ways, it's not feasible based on what we're hearing. So we are recommending going from a 2-year to a 3-year construction period for the Northwood project. This also applies to Damascus. The Woodward reopening, that is being delayed because of the Northwood. Obviously, Northwood is at that facility during their stay while we're rebuilding their school. So subsequently, that is being impacted. And then even Joanne Lullock, the size and scope of that project is extending that out a year based on just the construction complexities. But I will say, just from a timeline perspective, so we're talking about a one year delay of opening, just purely from a construction process. But I did want to add too that cost is still a really big factor that we're dealing with. And I just mentioned the bids came in last week, and we've worked with the vendor, or we worked with the contractor yesterday to really look at the numbers. What we're seeing on Northwood is the numbers are higher than what we were even predicting from escalation. I've mentioned to everyone that we've put in all sorts of different provisions, everything from, coming back and asking for additional funds for an auditorium, coming back and doing additional funds for the stadium or fields, doing a prevailing, non-prevailing approach. What we're seeing on Northwood presently, and because I know the 1-year delay is important, but presently what we're seeing on Northwood is that the funds are not there to go through with any of the scenarios that we put forward, including not building the auditorium, not doing the stadium, unless we went to a non-prevailing wage direction. So as we go through this CIP, I wanted to put that in there for context because, again, we're working with our communities about the impacts of a 1-year delay. But if we can't even start, it's going to be much, much worse. It's going to be much more impactful than even the impacts of a construction period. So we'll be coming back at the next work session to really talk through what this means. We're working with our Office of Management and Budget around, is it better to ask for more money for Northwood and do prevailing wage, or does it make more sense to potentially forfeit some state aid and do non-prevailing and move forward with what we have? Again, as a Board of Education, as a school district, we theoretically have enough money to move forward. It's just now funding sources, and what are the impacts of funding sources? So we're gonna work through that. But I wanted to frame that because, again, 1-year delay is not a great thing. It's something that we obviously take to heart, and one thing that we want to make sure we deliver on what we say. But at the same time, we're also struggling just to figure out how to start this project based on the current market conditions and what we're seeing from a bid experience. So just wanted to frame it. We'll be coming back with a menu of options. We'll be coming back with what the OMB folks, the county executive's office, is saying. We'll come back from what the state of Maryland is saying, just around what we should do, what we shouldn't do. But this is pretty impactful. It's sort of late breaking for us. I would assume the same will apply to Crown High School as well. So, as we go further into that process and when that bids, we're going to have to obviously face some of the similar challenges. But it is something that I didn't want to go too far into our CIP and not bring it up, because it is something that's likely to be very impactful as we move forward.
Can I just ask a quick question? Yes. The additional from going from 2 years to 3 years, would that be a permanent thing, or is that going to be something that we're just doing now because of the current situations?
And that's a great question. For high schools, I think it really depends on what the scope of work we're doing. We are going to strongly recommend that our elementaries move from 18-month to a 2-year process. Again, seeing what was experienced this last summer. Even Woodland, that already went to a 2-year process, and obviously we're working through that. But I do think across the board, you're going to start seeing timelines extended for construction until hopefully some of the supply chain issues diminish, until some of the market conditions change. But for now, I do think it's in our best interest to have time periods that make sense for our students and staff to transition smoothly back into schools versus go into buildings that are partially incomplete, boxes and supplies everywhere, everyone's scrambling last minute. That's not in the best interest of anyone. And
I agree. I just want to mention that, we hardly ever see CIP projects coming, recommended CIP projects coming for any of our holding facilities. Some of them could use some renovations and stuff, and I know it's not something that we want to take dollars away from permanent buildings, but if we're going to continue to expand the amount of time that our students spend in them, I just want to make sure that their bathrooms are up and running okay, and that their air quality is good and whatever. So,
Mr. Said?
Yeah, I see a lot of great projects here for Damascus, for Eastern, things students have talked about for a while. Just so kind of we have it on the record and we specifically went over, I know a lot of students at Wooten High School are asking, when is our school going to get renovated? I see all these projects here, and I want to know, just so if a Wooten student comes to me tomorrow and says, hey, what's the deal? I didn't see my school on here. What can we say to them? What are we doing with Wooten High School?
So there has been no change to completion dates of Wooten and Magruder based on the last CIP. I believe they were in 2029 as the completion date. Wooten, though, however, there was funds appropriated early to do some site improvements, ADA improvements. So we will be going out. We've done a survey of the interior conditions, exterior. We're going to go out and talk to them about what improvements we can do in the interim. But the Magruder and Wooten projects remain unchanged based on this recommendation. But I would say, though, however, when we look, and this is just make sure everyone's on the same page in terms of what we're looking at from a CIP, those are projects that are in the out years. And those are projects that have funds that will have to come back and possibly add more, address at some point in the future. But they're also projects that will be very impactful to being able to move forward with the Northwoods, the Crowns, some of the Damascus projects. So when we come back at the next CIP, we're going to go through sort of the year by year. What are the impacts to not only what are the impacts of keeping Northwood on schedule, and what are the impacts of associated projects that are in a CIP? What are possible impacts if revenues don't come in? What are impacts if bonds don't come in? What are impacts if state aid is not assumed correctly? We're going to talk about that. So today, the Wooten project, the Magruder project are on the same schedule as they were previously, but we will obviously have to continue to view them as part of the whole CIP as we move forward.
And I just want to add, both Wooten and Magruder do have in the FY 25 to 30 have an FY 25 appropriation for planning. So as Mr. Adams said, Wooten got funds accelerated to start doing their site work, but it was site work, not building. So both Wooten and Magruder now have FY 25 dollars being recommended at this point for an appropriation to start actually the building. the design of the building.
So we'll be able to see Wooten in the larger plan during the work sessions.
So all of the major capital projects, so we have Poolsville, are in two what we call master projects. It's either the major capital projects elementary or major capital projects secondary. So when you look at chapter 1 and that Excel spreadsheet that has all the projects and the dollars, it's not called out because it's in those two master projects. But if you look at the end of chapter 1 and you look at what we call the Bible, which has every project and what's being requested, recommended, and the completion date, you will see Wooten and Magruder there. So it's on page, actually, and I could even tell you the page if I could see. It is on page 1-7. 1-6, 1-7, and it will actually call out the projects. You just don't see them in that line item expenditure table because they are sub-projects of those two master projects.
Okay, and just real quick, just so I have it on note, what's the completion date for Eastern Middle School? 2028? Okay, thank you. Thank you so much.
So in summary, Wooten is in there, but it's in the out years, and it might get impacted with some of the changes that we're going to have to make some of these projects happen.
We hope it's not impacted, but I think it's just important, again, to put it out there that as we navigate continued increased costs and everything that we outlined today, it is a strong possibility. We don't have many projects in the CIP in the out years. I mean, that's the other effect to this, right? So when you think about the out years, we've just added 4 elementaries as part of the major capital project, elementary. We have not really touched anything from the secondary other than to put construction funds in for Eastern. Everything else remains as is. So as the CIP continues to move forward, you hear things like CIP is front loaded. No, we're as we continue to build, we're actually not adding anything to the CIP. So when you think about if things have to come out, there's only things that we're talking about are the 4 elementaries that we added with placeholders, Wooten and Magruder, and maybe some of the addition projects which aren't really that impactful from an overall dollar perspective. So in the grand scheme of things, there's just not much in our overall capital improvements program.
Okay. Ms. Harris has a question.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, I have 2. The first one, I think, and I apologize, I do not have my CIP book with me. I had to leave town before I could get it, and this may be in an appendix, but do we have a list of the HVAC backlog projects? That is an ongoing concern of mine, that those projects are essential to having a healthy school building and environment for people to be in, but we do keep having to struggle to fund those.
So currently, the intended list is not included in the CIP. Obviously, we've distributed that year by year to the board as follow-up, but certainly it's something that we could consider adding. The reason it's not included, and I would just say, is that during reconciliation, which is, once you make your request, it goes to the county executive, it goes to the county council. Many times, I'd say majority of the times over the last decade, HVAC money, roofing money was reduced as part of reconciliation. There's no real public comments on it. There's no discussion. It's a reconciliation process that happens and then ultimately gets a vote. So what we found is when we went out and told communities, you're going to get your HVAC project as part of this capital improvements program, it was just like that in May that it went away because we lost funding. So we've been trying to navigate managing expectations around that, but I think at the same time we've been really trying to inform the public around what that process is, and if there's an opportunity to publish a list and reinforce the importance of maintaining that funding throughout, then absolutely we're ready to do so.
And the other question I have, and I know Mr. Adams, I've mentioned this to you before, and I think to some others. So I would like, and I know we'll do this at the next work session, but I really am very interested to see what the major capital project is for Cold Spring. Because when I look at the Wooten cluster, we have 6 elementary schools, all are under capacity. 4 of the 6 are majorly under capacity. As a cluster, those elementary schools have 705 available seats. And so, we don't ever want, and this is just me thinking, with a very strong eye on the fiscal bottom line, we don't want any student or staff member or family member or volunteer or anything in a school that needs work to be a safe, healthy environment to be in. But I just have to ask, when I look at a cluster of 6 elementary schools with 705 available seats, why we have 6 elementary schools in that cluster. So just something, I've been looking at this for a couple of years now, and the enrollment numbers are not changing. These schools, this cluster is dramatically under-enrolled in its elementary capacity. So just a question I want us to keep in mind, or certainly I'm going to be keeping in mind as we look at where we're going with our capital projects.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a great question. And again, I think that actually further enforces the placeholder discussion. We look at a Cold Spring, and Cold Spring Elementary is the last school that we have as a truly open school. We were not able to close it up. If you remember the 70 schools, which are the open concept, all of them except for Cold Spring were able to close portions. Cold Spring is still open. So as part of a key facility indicator, it's very high on the priority list. So when we go through that process and we start to look at that school, we will not only look at it from a perspective of its current enrollment, but what are the opportunities around pre-K, special ed, all the things that we just talked about from a blueprint perspective, to be able to maximize, every dollar spent, on going as far as it can possible. So those are projects that we would likely come back to you all and say, this is the scope, this is what we think the dollar figure is, and then obviously make decisions at that point. But you are correct, there is available capacity. But also beyond that, there's adjacent clusters that also have some challenges with overutilization. So, it's not necessarily just an individual school or an individual cluster, as we've talked about. Geographically, these types of issues should not be bound by just cluster lines, and certainly something that we can explore moving forward as well.
And I completely agree with you. This is a conversation we've been having for about 5 years now about low-hanging fruit with adjacent schools with mismatches in their enrollment and capacity. But this has also been a part of the county where just the mere mention of the word boundary study has been very fraught, and in fact, in some ways, very ugly. And so, but our job is to use the tax dollar, the money that we have as wisely as we can. And so, again, this is one that I'm really looking at very, very closely, because we have a lot of schools that need work, and we have a lot of schools that do not have this kind of space available. So just something to keep in mind, because I really do think balancing out capacity and enrollment is one way to spend less on just the ongoing operation and maintenance of the building. So anyway.
Ms. Yang?
Yes. Hi. I just have a comment. I really appreciate to see our elementary school on the project list for our years. Around the board tables, elementary students cannot come and share with us their perspective on their needs. And elementary school communities are generally smaller, so that the advocacy to come in out in numbers sometimes do not happen. But that's where where our families go in first to have their impressions with our school system, and also they have specific needs because of their age. Out of the 4 elementary schools here, I have firsthand knowledge of 2 of them being really in great need of upgrade and actually, construction as I see it. So I appreciate, that's my comment.
Let's continue.
Okay. So for going back to the slide, next slide, please. So this shows the distribution of the superintendent recommended CIP, and the largest portion is the capacity project that includes new schools, additions and replacement of schools, which is about $653 million, and that is 33% of total budget. And the next big one is a major capital project that includes project and identified as KFI evaluations, and that is about 33% as well, but it's $655 million. And then the county-wide project that include ADA compliance or infrastructure project addressing through the systemic renovations or replacement. And that is about 25% of the total budget. And then the last one is technology modernization, which is 9% of the total budget.
And we added this slide because we do hear a lot of times, especially during public hearing testimony, that we should be spending money on X, or I need, our community needs, and we know that they are across the board. And so, there are priorities. We have the priorities, the board's priorities that were sort of developed years ago. And you can see from this slide, actually, Tech Mod falls under the county-wides, right? Our CIP is basically in 3 different pieces. It's county-wides, it's major capital projects, it's the individual schools. If you add the Tech Mod to the county-wides, the budget is actually exactly split up in those 3 categories evenly. And so we are funding, for the most part, the number of projects is different, but the dollars that are going to each one of those pieces of the pie are basically exactly the same.
Okay, next slide, please. So this chart shows the individual school project, and I just go through some of the highlight. And Blake High School addition project was added for the planning and the construction fund, and we requested additional fund for the Burtonsville Elementary School replacement project. And we also requested additional funding for the Joanne Lelek Elementary School at Broad Acres replacement project. And also the Mill Creek Town Elementary School addition project was added for planning and the construction fund. And the Paint Branch High School addition was added to request the planning and the construction fund as well. And just one more thing about the Burtonsville Elementary School project. We actually successfully accelerate 1 year. So instead of completion date to be 2027, now the completion of Burtonsville Elementary School is 2026. And that is because actually the Burtonsville new elementary school is at the new site. So we didn't have to demolish the existing building, and then the condition is very different. That's why we could accelerate 1 year for that project. Next slide, please. And this shows a county project. They have all the ADA compliance and the Early Childhood Center project and all that. But we're gonna come back to this, all these projects for next work sessions for more details. But we just wanna highlight CSC modifications is added, and also the Healthy School was added to this CIP, as I mentioned previously. Next slide, please. And then next one is continuing the county-wide project, and this includes the major capital project for elementary school, as we just talked about for elementary schools. And this is, as we mentioned, we have a full planning fund and then placeholder for the construction fund. And then the major capital project for the secondary schools are like Eastern Middle School and like Damascus High Schools.
The bottom chart is the superintendent's recommended CIP for the 6 years. So you can see the 1.99, and then you can see the year-by-year expenditures. I did box the first 2 years because those numbers are higher than they have ever been. So our approved first 2 years in our approved CIP, I don't remember them exactly. I think it's like 380 and 355. These numbers are 466 and 477. So they're about $100 million more in each year. So $200 million more in the first 2 years than comparing it to the first 2 years in the approved CIP. And so when we talk about non-recommended, when we talk about funding sources, when we talk about all of those things, it is just something to remember. Mr. Adams brought up the idea of, us front-loading our CIP. It is not that it is front-loaded. Those are the projects, those numbers, those large numbers represent our construction projects. We have 7 high school projects in our CIP. I think in all the years I've been here, I can't remember that we've ever had 7. So, Northwood's construction dollars are in those first couple of years. Woodward's numbers are in those first couple of years. We still have Poolsville construction dollars. Poolsville is still underway, has construction dollars. Damascus has construction dollars. Crowns, thank you, construction dollars. So when we talk about, what if we're asked to do non-recommended, it isn't like the new ones, for example. So if you look at, what we just talked about, Blake, Paint Branch, Mill Creek Town are new ones. A lot of conversation is sort of last one in, first one out, if you have to address that. But when you look at those expenditures in the first 2 years for those projects, they're nominal. It's a couple $1 million compared to our construction projects. And so that is something that we always grapple with when the county executive's recommendation comes out and it doesn't align with the board's request, we are asked to come back with non-recommended reductions. It usually impacts the first 2 years.
What's the first box? 315.
At the bottom, that's the appropriation. So the appropriation is usually not a contentious item. I mean, that is a large number, 315, but I actually think it was larger in the approved CIP. It really is the year-by-year expenditure, not necessarily the appropriation. The appropriation is sort of that dollar amount that allows us to, write the checks to our contractors to start the work. It's really the year-by-year because SAG is year-by-year.
Go ahead.
All right, I think the next slide brings us to discussion.
Why don't we move? I think we have a few more.
Yeah, so I'll go through the next slides pretty quickly. They are this is the non-capital recommendation, and this is where we talk about things like boundary studies. So we just wanted to highlight here, based on the recommendation to extend Northwood by a year, that certainly will impact what was previously approved by the board around the Woodward boundary study. The timeline associated with it. And this is something that we will talk about, but the idea of what we approved, what the board approved last time, was being very strategic about when the decision was made in advance of moving into the new school. With that school being pushed out a year, this is likely to require being addressed, because it just doesn't make sense to make a recommendation 2 years in advance of when a school were to open. So we will be coming back with most likely an amendment to the Woodward boundary. And if we go to the next slide, I think one thing that we also wanted to highlight was obviously the timeline and the reasons why this would need to be amended. We did have some conversations with different parents around what the impacts are, what's the status of the boundary, what does it mean to the boundary study process. It really just means a 1-year extension of what was previously approved. However, what I would highlight is that this then Woodward, if we go to the next slide, Woodward then becomes aligned with when we would need to do boundary studies for Crown High School as well as Damascus High School. So the idea is that we're going to spend some time between now and when we come back for spring amendments to really do a deep dive, talk about this with different communities. What are the opportunities? What are the challenges? What are the impacts of having 3 large high school boundary studies happening at the same time? What does that look like with 3 different consultants, 1 consultant? You know, what are the opportunities just to make sure that we think about this holistically and make sure we come back to the board with a recommendation that makes the most sense from all communities impacted by this.
And I know there's 6 in the CIP, 6 high schools in CIP, but with half of them coming up for consideration for boundaries, would this be a time where we would, as a system, consider looking at countywide boundaries, or no?
So that is one of the things that as we go through and really look at having these 3 large ones and the scope of these 3 large happening at the same time, is there economies of scale that would allow more opportunities to look at it broadly? So that is something that we will certainly come back to you all with is from a superintendent's recommendation, but that's not going to be part of this CIP process. That will come back for spring amendments in February. But we just wanted to highlight it and provide some background on it. And with that, I think we can go to the next slide. That's discussion on that, and maybe we can wrap up. One more slide, I'll just talk about what's the next work session. Next work session is really diving into the details of each one of those countywide perspectives. You know, there's projects that are embedded in each of these projects that we want to highlight and bring to your attention, that obviously deserve to be brought to your attention and talk through. And obviously we'll come back and talk about the Northwood bid experience, what that means for Northwood, what that means for possibly Crown, and then walk through our capital maintenance comprehensive plan and how that sort of aligns with our capital improvements program. As you heard, as we heard from Ms. Harris, you know, what are the implications of our operating budget by reducing or extending different programs, you know, replacement projects. So we just want to be able to highlight that and walk that through. But that will be at the next work session on the 10th. But with that, we'll turn it over for any questions or discussion.
Just one question I had about the shifting the time frame from 2-year construction to 3-year. Have the affected school communities been informed of that and the reasons why that's necessary?
So we did go over this at the open house for Northwood on Thursday. The feedback we heard was this needs to go much broader, obviously, and that's correct. We met with MCCPTA and cluster leadership of those schools and went through what the impacts are. So the idea is that we're going to start developing a communication strategy to make sure all students are impacted. What we're hearing, particularly around Northwood, is that, you know, as being part of the consortium and being part of the choice process, you know, parents and families and students want to know what those impacts are before or during the decision-making process and what the impacts are. So we'll be coming back, obviously. Hopefully the communication will already have happened and we'll provide those updates, but we are working with the various MCPS groups as well as our partners in the community to be able to communicate the impacts here.
And we also have spoken to the consortium office. So they are fully aware of what the recommendation is. They are starting to think about what that means, how they can work with the community, you know, the flexibility, because I believe that it's this week that they have to put in their applications. And so they're aware of it. We will continue to work with them. They will continue to work with the communities as well.
And have you had a chance to update the ENC committee about this? I imagine council will get constituent concerns about it as well.
We wanted the opportunity to have this work session and talk through it, but after this we'll have a very robust communication. We'll reach out to, you know, education and culture, obviously work with our communication team to do some broad messaging around, you know, the importance of this, obviously not only from a public hearing, but also just what this means to different communities. So yes, following this meeting, we have a pretty packed schedule of going out and updating everyone around.
Great. No, I think the impacted families and students will help us think through maybe things that we haven't thought of yet in terms of what that means, having a longer time to wait for your school building to be open.
Particularly in dollars and cents, if you could, you had said before earlier you were going to do an analysis of some of the projects and things, if you could, it'd be helpful to be able to say, this is what it would cost if we tried to keep this on schedule, even if it was at all possible, versus the benefits of waiting a year or expanding it a year.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
yes.
but in addition, you said the companies have said, we can't do it. We can't sign, we can't sign on the dotted line to do it. So that's important to communicate. If there are no other questions, this concludes the superintendent's presentation and our CIP work session. Yes? If board members have any further questions, please reach out to our chief of staff or hold them for our next work session.
And one moment, Ms. Silvestri, I did want to say, I know this was a lot of information today. Our first meeting around the capital project always is. Every time we go through this every year, we know that there's just a lot of covering the basics about where all the funding streams come from and how those things have changed over time. But the work sessions are going to be really important. Where we get to dive into some of these details when we look more at equity across the county, when we look at more of, enrollment and seats and space in different spaces. This is when we will have an opportunity to get into detail. You asked the question here towards the end about, working with other stakeholders. That was one of the things that we made a strong commitment to last spring, which is that we would be working with our communities and we're going to be, engaging others, as well as our county partners as well, because we know whenever our families have concerns, they want to be able to share that and express that. And so we want everybody to have the most up-to-date information and understanding about why these recommendations are the recommendations that we're making. And if we come and continue in these work sessions to say there's some other direction, the board wants us to consider, we'll continue to go back and work through that. But I just wanted to, acknowledge it. I know it's a lot of information today, but we will have the opportunity over the coming weeks to get into much more detail about a lot of what we've discussed today. So thank you so much for that.
Also wanted to thank the staff. I thought it was a very informative,
That was the next thing, yes.
well-presented presentation.
The staff is always so good in going through the details. It's especially when it comes down to all these pieces around enrollment and how we're also, today they did a beautiful job of just kind of bringing in the blueprint is really playing a big part into a lot of what we have to do now and take considerations into the CIP that we didn't have to take into consideration before. And, there's been all the conversation about all of the funding that's required, but, many of these things are connected. So the staff has just kind of been working. They have been working, with other offices, knowing that we really can't talk about one part of the CIP without talking about programming and what the needs are and how we expand on that. Pre-K was the perfect example that came up today, and how we're going to be using facilities in a very different way to make sure we're meeting that need, because not just because it's required in the blueprint, but we know that our families want to have pre-K and have access to it in many of our neighborhoods, and as Ms. Rivera-Oven said, full-time, and Ms. Wolf, so that students can take advantage of that. And we need that too, because then they've got to come prepared into kindergarten as a result of that. So many things kind of coalescing here and connecting, but as we get into the details over the next few weeks, I look forward to us, just coming out with even more robust action plans that reflect what we're hearing from our community and what our board priorities are for the district.
I just want to make a plug for something Ms. Rivera-Oven said also is explain it to us so that we can explain it to any constituent, right? It is dense and people have incredible interest in school construction because these are the buildings that their kids go into every single day. So help us develop some talking points so that we can explain it to anybody we see at the supermarket or in the streets and so forth. So thank you for that. Mr. Said.
All right. I move that the board meet in closed session to address topics posted on the resolution for today's closed session and for the reasons and on the basis stated therein.
Second.
All in favor, raise your hands. And that's unanimous with those present. We will now go into closed session. We adjourned.